Hello there, viewers, and welcome to Cartoon Gateway. I'm your host, David Hollander. Here's a little known fact about me. I'm working on a sequel to I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream for once it goes public domain. The working title is presently So I'm back in the chair, I got the thing behind me. Does this mean Cartoon Gateway is back for good? No. Did you pay attention last time I showed up? You know, in the Stream of Consciousness special? Which I'm led to believe no one watched. If you see me again, it's a special occasion. You know, like a fun uncle that drops by every other year or two, who's able to entertain the family, but nobody knows where he lives. I want every uncle vibe aside from creepy uncle. I draw the line at that uncle archetype. Incidentally, if that first joke didn't give it away, while my show does discuss cartoons and animation, I'm not always kid-friendly. Sometimes I talk about stuff like Rick and Morty, or Futurama, or Spy Family, which ain't necessarily kid stuff. I bring that up in case some parent decides to watch this with their kid or turns on this episode for their kid but doesn't actually watch it. For the sake of not alienating my audience this time, I'm doing my best to keep things as kid-friendly as possible for this episode. We're talking about kid shows, by which I mean shows for the youngins, the sometimes educational programming for the preschool crowd. The cartoons are the first things we see when we pop out of the crib and onto the couch. I know I am the furthest thing from the appropriate audience, but I was a kid, and I can tell you, there's an art to these things. Making programming that is both palatable for young viewers, and which is also generally a good show, while having some kind of lesson to teach, because no parent would show their kids a cartoon if there wasn't some kind of beneficial message. That's the art of preschooler programming. You know how I know that this is a serious business? I have applied to script writing contests that have entire blocks dedicated to just preschool programming. There are classes taught on how to write for very young kids. That would not be the case if this were not a big deal. Now, personally, I've always been of the belief that you can show a kid anything in a cartoon, as long as you're tasteful about it, and they're going to understand or at least be totally fine. But I'll admit, that core belief of mine kind of falls apart when the kid in question is so young they have to have a song to learn where their head, shoulders, knees and toes are located on their bodies. Writers who make stuff for older audiences really have to pull their punches when writing for the youngest children. It's why I've gotten unending respect for writers who make stuff for preschoolers specifically, because I'd have to unlearn so many instincts to do that. So what are some of the first examples that spring to mind when I think of these kinds of shows? The first one I usually think of is Thomas and Friends. Not a cartoon in the traditional sense, but I could probably pay for college 3 times over with all the merchandise my parents got me as a kid. I give my parents a lot of grief, but you know, credit where credit's due, they're weirdly generous with Thomas. Thomas and Friends is a simple show with trains learning to navigate situations in a kid-friendly way. Except the show is terminally British. There's a lot of weird undertones in the show that don't read as particularly screwed up until you examine them. The steam engines are all encouraged to be useful, and if they aren't, they're openly threatened with the scrapyard, which feels kinda morbid. The equivalent to this would be if the puppies in Paw Patrol were told they had to be good dogs or get the old Yeller treatment, if you catch my drift. The weird emphasis on disproportionate punishment in the Thomas series feels like just an outgrowth of the series' British roots. Like, I fully believe this is just how the British raise their young, but that kind of thing doesn't translate well in American markets, so obviously the show was toned down as it went on. Another, more openly educational series is Word Girl, which I'll admit was kinda just a bit past my time. A shame I didn't grow up with this one because it's quite good by all accounts. Equal parts educational with its focus on definitions and vocabulary, and entertaining with its fun characters and dialogue that's way wittier than it has any right to be. There's also Backyardigans, which uses music to teach lessons on social skills to viewers. A lot of shows from that time period used music a lot, like Wonder Pets and Little Einsteins. But I shout out Backyardigans because I watched this when I was 3 and I still occasionally get these songs stuck in my head. Hang on, I want to try something. I want to try something, hang on. I needed to refresh myself. I want to try something real quick. I'm an international super spy. I'm willing to bet some of you Backyardigans kids watching this were just activated like sleeper agents just from that opening couplet. Speaking of, it was actually Backyardigans that inspired me to make this episode. Not the original series, but rather the reboot. That for the life of me, looks AI generated. I can't put that in a, I fear children's entertainment is dropping the pretense and just becoming low effort, which would be a shame because there was a ton of effort into all the shows I mentioned and more. I could also talk about Transformers Rescue Bots and, to a lesser extent, Bluey. I've talked about both those shows elsewhere at length, so I think I'll manage going without. But you saw the title of this episode, or saw the thumbnail, or skipped ahead, or your TV guide told you. I'm assuming this is airing on TV at some point. You know what I'm getting at. There's one kid show in particular that I think of that had so much effort put into it, so many systems at play, that not a lot of people talk about. Can we fix it? If you didn't answer, yes, we can, then you've been exposed, robot doppelganger. Bob the Builder, another one I grew up on, and another show I'm giving the Futurama treatment by watching all of it that I can. That's right, I watched all of this series that was available on Paramount Plus just for this particular episode. There's 18 seasons plus some change because I went out of my way to find some bonus content. If anyone needs information to blackmail me with at any point, I watched Bob the Builder front to back before watching Avatar: The Last Airbender all the way through. Yeah, as an aside, I know I've joked about Paramount Plus being kind of a barren wasteland in the past because I'm not a Star Trek fan, but you know, for credit where it's due, any streaming service that has every season of Bob the Builder, that ain't nothing to scoff at. And it took until around season 15, I think it was, before I noticed any episode that was noticeably out of order, which is better than most preschool shows on streaming services. Oh, and to be clear, I'm talking about the original Bob the Builder series, the one that ran from 1999 to 2011. I'm not talking about the reboot from 2014. I did not watch it, and am therefore not an authority on it. And I have to mention that, did you know that the creator of Bob the Builder went on to make Paw Patrol? I feel like I should have known that. So what made the original Bob the Builder so great? Well, a lot of things, but I think we'll need to go back to basics. I don't think I need to explain what the show's about. Bob and Wendy are builders. Scoop, Lofty, Rolly, Dizzy, and Muck are their machines. There's a living scarecrow in there somewhere, and they build and fix stuff. It's not rocket science. The show uses these characters to teach things like cooperation, socialization, and conflict resolution, among other skills. When I was 6, I tried making concrete based on the show's instructions. I still use Bob's trick of counting elephants to figure out how far away storms are. Not academically minded like Word Girl, but educational nonetheless. That's the general format of the show. The crew goes on a construction job, shenanigans happen, the characters learn things, and working together, they get the job done. The machines are generally more childlike and prone to making mistakes. Bob isn't just their boss, he's basically a parental figure for them who helps them work through their issues. Most of the time, the crew is helping out one of the many side characters on the show, like Mr. Bentley, the building inspector, or Farmer Pickles, or plenty of others. When they aren't dealing with the hijinks, they're usually dealing with Spud, that living scarecrow I mentioned. Spud's a mischievous and dim-witted scarecrow who's the usual source of shenanigans. Source of shenanigans. Spud's the source of shenanigans. Spud's the scarecrow source of shenanigans. There's a tongue twister in there somewhere. Don't put this in the video. I have to commend this show for making Spud consistently mischievous, but not annoying or malicious. Should also probably mention Travis the Tractor, the most frequently appearing machine in the show aside from the crew, who's the definition of just being nearby. That's Travis. As for the individual machines, Scoop is the unofficial leader of the group, responsible but with a tendency to get in over his head with work. Lofty is a shy and skittish crane with a fear of heights. Rolly is a steamroller who's a tad clumsy. Dizzy is a hand-powered cement mixer, the youngest and smallest of the team. And Muck. I don't know what Muck is supposed to be. Some kind of bulldozer with a dump bed? The show only ever calls Muck a digger. Self-loading dump trucks exist, but I haven't found a single one that looks like Muck. In any case, Muck likes getting a little dirty and is a little more prone to fooling around than the others. Something to note before we go on, the original series is basically a trilogy, split up into 3 shows that are usually counted as one series, just with different subheadings. The first of which, the original series, is probably the most formulaic and the most reliant on Spud being a rascal. It focuses entirely on the crew in the small town of Bobsville. It also had the fewest machines. The only important ones I didn't mention are Trix, the forklift who works at the supplier's yard, and Skip, who is a vehicle that we basically don't have in America, so I'm just gonna call him a garbage truck. Tangent for a sec, am I colorblind? Skip just looked yellow to me as a kid. But nah, he's chartreuse, which is More green than yellow. Am I colorblind or something? The original series was very minimalist. It really surprised me how long it took before they introduced new machines outside of the original crew and also Travis. It took until about halfway through season 6 before we got Trix, Skip, and the cast of the Supplier's Yard. And honestly, you'd think that a Supplier's Yard would have been introduced much earlier in the show, but these guys are only with us a few seasons. The original series ran for 9 seasons before picking up with a new sub-series, Bob the Builder, Project Build It. This series picked up with Bob designing a sustainable city plan that preserves the beautiful Sunflower Valley, rather than building on top of it. While his vision saves the valley, he gets saddled with building the thing himself. So Project Build It has the crew relocate to Sunflower Valley, where Bob is building his vision from the ground up. Farmer Pickles, Travis, Spud, Mr. Bentley, and a few other characters stuck around, but you can kiss anyone who worked for the Supplier's Yard goodbye. A shame, because they should have been around from the start. But we do get the addition of Scrambler, the quad bike speed demon of the crew who's mostly transport. Also Benny, a small digger that they took from one of the movies who's sort of a part-time member of the crew. Yes, there are movies, I'll get to that. There's a few other big differences between this and the original show. Project Build It focuses a lot more on sustainable living. Houses are built into nature, materials are more sustainable, stuff is really eco-friendly, that kind of thing. Oh no, they're pushing environmentalism on the kids. Well, calm down, adults, because as someone with eyes, I can tell you that we've been pushing environmentalism on kids since the 90s, and it's resulted in absolutely nothing. Look, it fits the setting change, plus there's always gonna be someone who wants to live more sustainably, and all of you supervillains out there, you know, it won't thwart your dastardly plans to boil the West Coast alive, and at that point, I see no issue. They also introduced a lot more machines here. There's less than 10 machines in the original series, and I swear in only 7 seasons, they double that number in Project Build It. But I'm not about to complain about that yet. We still have a bit more to get through. Finally, after Project Build It, the original series ended with Ready, Steady, Build, a new show which moves our crew to Fixham Harbor, ditches a bunch of the additional characters from Sunflower Valley, but introduces junior member of the crew, Scratch, a small digger who just wants to help and who looks way too similar to Benny for his own good. I get it, he had to be a digger, why do you have to be practically the same digger as Benny? It's just kind of jarring. Speaking of jarring, the series moved from stop motion to 3D CG animation. Oh, and there's no transition. At all. Like, they straight up don't explain why everybody's moved to Fixham. The series focused mostly on Scratch trying to fit in with the established group, but also had several episodes focused on the older characters in the new setting. One advantage of the CG animation is that the things the crew builds are now a lot bigger and a lot more impressive. But this series only ran for 2 seasons before the original Bob the Builder trilogy came to a close, so I'm going to look at everything from the original series through Ready, Steady, Build. And while I don't have much to say about them, I should bring up the many specials and movies of Bob the Builder. These are charming and worth checking out. Heck, A Christmas to Remember was legitimately my first exposure to Elton John as a kid. Like, there's value here. That said, why aren't these on Paramount Plus? Look, I don't know much about the law, so I guess certain stuff is just unavailable due to copyright buggery. But when some of these specials are basically required viewing for the show, and I know for a fact they used to be on Paramount Plus, it really gets a snake in my boot, you know? In any case, I guess I should talk about how there's 2 English dubs of the show, the original UK version and the American version. I'm not about to get into which is better, because that's futile, but I should mention why this exists at all. Usually when a show is redubbed, it's dubbed in a different language. Here, it's still English, just American English. I know why they do this. Preschoolers and kids learning to speak might pick up an accent, plus it helps clear up some of the terminology or anything that might seem odd to Americans. But there are some notable things about the different dubs. First off, while the American version occasionally replaced certain voice actors as it went on, the British one kept the same cast all the way through. While the British dub is the one on Paramount Plus and appears almost completely preserved, there's a small number of American dub episodes that haven't been released digitally, and thus there's a small chunk of series technically considered lost media. And most jarringly, the US dub made Muck a girl when the character was a boy in the UK version. Gender bending is not a new thing, I guess. And as much as I get brand synergy, I do support this change. Muck is a character who does as much hard work as the others, loves getting dirty, and is a bit of a jokester. You don't really see girl characters like that in shows for this demographic, but I get why Muck is back to being a guy in the reboot. So parents, if you're showing your kids this show, don't swap between the US and UK versions if you can help it. Saves the kids the confusion. Unless you want Muck to be a gender fluid icon for some reason, in which case, you know what to do. I personally grew up with the American version, but honestly, there's no harm in showing the UK dub to an American kid. Like, I get the accent thing, but we show our kids Bluey, which doesn't have an American redub and is unashamedly Australian. Like, do you literally know what any of the non-American slang means? Like, no. Can you figure it out pretty easily anyway? Because of the context clues? Yes, that's why it's charming. And speaking of non-American slang, Britain, come here, Britain. I'll give you that you have the more logical use of football. It is a ball game with your foot. I get that, you win. But the word soccer is an English language word with late 19th century British origins. We did not come up with the word soccer. And if you were gonna make fun of us for using it, why did you come up with it? But now that I'm done talking about the dubbing or the premise, I want to talk about why this show is so good as a kid show or pre-K audience show. And to do that, we need to understand the sights, sounds, and feel of the show. That's 3 out of the 5 senses. I'm not going into how it smells or tastes. Ah yes, lofty smells like bunions and tastes of cream. See, that'd be psychotic. First of all, it's important to note how the show looks and feels, among other things. This is a very sensory show. The first thing you might notice is that it's stop motion. And I hasten to add, not claymation, because, claymation is not an animation style, it's supposed to be a brand name. Like how everyone calls them Band-Aids, even though that's the name of the company and the actual object is bandages. I'm sorry, that's a weird tangent to get on. That clay look of the show is one of the best things about it. The cement is very obviously putty. The bushes are very obviously cardboard, but that's charming. It makes the show very texturous. I don't think that's a word, but I struggle to think of a better word. The water doesn't look or feel like water you'd see in a show that's 2D. And while it's mostly a byproduct of being stop motion in general, I think that gives the show a very distinct feel to it. Everything in the show looks enticing to the touch. It's important when making children's media to make a world that a child would want to explore. And children do a lot of exploring the world by, well, picking up stuff and squeezing it or playing with it. From feathers to clay, kids pick up anything that has an interesting texture, and this show plays into that inherent curiosity. It gives the show the sensation that you want to reach out and grab it, run your fingers through it. This is especially true in Project Build It, when the dirt they use is just actual dirt and it really feels like the characters get grimy from messing with it. This is something that's lost a bit in Ready Steady Build when they transition to CG that doesn't really replicate textures, but that doesn't really undo any of the good feel from the preceding seasons. And while the textures are one thing, the actual art style is smooth and inviting. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about the reboot because I hadn't watched it, but there is one criticism I can make with complete confidence, and that's the character design. The humans look just like normal humans in the reboot, which is a bit odd considering most reboots make the art style simpler. But this reboot just generally makes things more realistic looking all around. I'm just saying, compare this to how rounded and stylized the humans look in the original series. Still recognizably human, just more friendly looking, with simple shapes and comparatively simple clothing. And the machines in the original series look just enough like their real-world counterparts while still blending in with the childish art style and without being off-putting. Going back to the reboot, I don't hate the redesigns the main crew got, they just all make the characters look more like real vehicles, which I think just looks odd in some instances. This stock image of reboot Dizzy has a very weird face. It looks like 3 years ago, Dizzy witnessed a car crash and hasn't been the same since. Not to discredit the new show, just pointing out, none of that in the original series. And the sounds of Bob the Builder are phenomenal. In real life, construction vehicles are loud and grating, but here, the sounds they make from moving are all pleasing to the ear, soft and gentle. And more importantly, the music of this show is really good. For a British show, it It feels like some kind of Americana, as the machines just drive from place to place with some guitar song playing that you'd think would get annoying, especially because there's a lot of driving around in the early episodes, but it's just so pleasant, it's hard to get mad about it. Meanwhile, the theme song is the kind of thing we stand for in my house. While the music of the show is very pleasant, the theme song itself is very percussive, using power tools sounds that immediately grab you. Every sound effect in general has the same tactile feel I mentioned earlier, as they're all very evocative. The only one I don't like is the sound of Bob spreading plaster on wallpaper. I won't play it, just know that it's a very uncomfortable sound. But other than that, excellent sound design, and I'm pleased to say this isn't something that Ready Steady Build struggled with. They kept a solid sound design. The show doesn't just look, feel, and sound good, it's actively enticing while also pleasant and calm, which is a far cry from the hyperactive shows parents might be used to. But enough about the senses. Let's talk about plot. I said before, the show does a great job of making Spud a rascal without being outright villainous. The stories can be simple, but that's their charm. The only downside of the show's narrative is that because it was on for so long, they had to reteach certain lessons. Like, I get that multiple generations need to learn these things, but watching the show all the way through has made me hesitant to borrow things, considering how many times I've heard, you shouldn't take things that aren't yours, Spud. Something else I noticed quickly in this show is that all of the human adults the machines work with are very patient, more so than most adults I know in real life. Example. Mr. Bentley shows up after a conference with the mayor of Bobsville, who's just awarded him a golden watch for his wonderful work. When he finds the crew working on the mayor's garage, Scoop accidentally runs over the watch, crushing it. Mr. Bentley is one of the more vocal adults in the show, and Scoop still gets just a, it's okay, it was an accident. Look, I don't know a single adult who wouldn't have gotten angry in Mr. Bentley's position, and that's a good thing. For Mr. Bentley, I mean, not the adults I know. The adults aren't losing their patience constantly with the misbehaving or mismanaged machines. It keeps the hostility very low. So the show can still reprimand characters in meaningful ways without coming off as condescending or overly mean to the well-intentioned machines, while also not being repetitive with the adults' anger. But how can the characters learn anything in meaningful ways if the adults don't get angry or yell? Glad you asked, proverbial viewer, because the machines are all inherently good people. Now, I don't want to get theological on you, but if a train needs the thread of the scrapyard to be a really useful engine, then they're probably not a really useful engine. Conversely, the machines here are very aware of their mistakes and mess-ups. Anything they even perceive as a failure immediately gets them. You don't have to make the characters feel bad by getting yelled at if they already feel bad themselves. It means when the adults do confront the machines about their mistakes, the adults are constructive, which fits for self-evident reasons. Plus, it gets the machines in the headspace to figure out solutions. This is a more convincing way to get children cognitive of their mistakes than just showing a cartoon character getting yelled at. Example. At a point when Dodger still is new to Sunflower Valley, he's tasked with picking up ingredients for the creamery to make cheese. Dodger quickly figures out how to make people laugh, which he conflates with getting people to like him. And while this works for a bit, it also causes Dodger to drop all the ingredients he was carrying, ruining the food. But after coming clean about his mistake, Dodger comes up with a pretty easy solution to the matter that actually benefits everyone involved. Dodger learns his lesson and fixes the problem. It's very important. You teach kids that mistakes are fixable more often than not. And also teaching kids that they can fix mistakes by themselves is a very empowering lesson. I remember being a kid, like really young, when I hadn't quite learned to put my dirty dishes in the sink. Some parent-aged adult would always holler at me from a different room, "David, you forgot to put your dishes away." I'd get up all like, "Oh, sorry, let me take care of that." And I'd see nothing on the table because that parent-aged adult had solved the problem in the time it took me to walk over there. All that does is rob a child of the satisfaction of fixing their mistake. Bob the Builder does the opposite of that, because it teaches kids problem-solving skills and shows that they don't need parents to employ them. This results in kids being a lot more eager to help when they have not just the skills to help, but also the satisfaction of using those skills. That's a way more convincing way to get kids to be helpful than just threatening them with punishment if they screw up. I also like the very simple world the show takes place in. This isn't like Cars, where you're constantly yelling questions at the screen the whole time. It's just simple. Vehicles are alive, they're here to help, there's not many vehicles around, and that's all that matters. No disasters, no crime, they don't need police. Bristle keeps the streets clean himself.
Clean as a whistle.
Considering most kids shows have very screwed up worlds when you analyze them for more than a second, I like the simplicity here. Not that it's completely non-sinister. I mean, Bob won Scrambler in a contest. Scrambler is a living being that was won. This country, man, avoiding the essential conversation about the ethics of Scrambler. And I think the naming conventions are a bit odd. Like, why do some of the machines just have regular people names? Like Trix, or Travis, or Benny, or Flex. But that's just adult me looking back at this show. I guarantee no kid is going to worry about that stuff, hence why I still think the world is very pleasant. Helping out the pleasant vibe of Bob the Builder is that the show is super casually funny. I don't mean it's outrageously funny or anything. I mean that the show delivers jokes in a super casual way you don't see cartoons doing a lot.
Hello? Hello? Oh. Oh dear.
Bob.
Hello?
I've never waited so long for dessert.
I'd say this is British humor, but I know for a fact British humor doesn't translate well with Americans, and this is still funny to me. An American, it's probably not British humor. Moreover, I think that the pleasantness of the show, among other things, actually makes Bob the Builder really good for children on the spectrum. Consider, adults are empathetic to children's problems and help out. Several problems in the show are communication issues. Dizzy clearly has some kind of sensory thing with music. The vibe is all about being pleasing to the senses, etc. Plus, it stuck out to me that Rolly is the one member of the main cast who doesn't have multiple uses since he's a road roller, but they also never look down on him for how situational he is. Rolly's still always included where he can be. Meanwhile, at no point is Lofty overly criticized for his anxiety, when in real life, I'd question how he ever got a license to operate heavy machinery. I dare you to figure out what that means in this context. If Bear in the Big Blue House taught me anything, it's that kids on the spectrum really respond to media with this calm atmosphere, nurturing caregivers and sensory stimulation. Maybe I'm grasping at straws here, but hey, I was a kid on the spectrum and I totally ate this show up, so do with that what you will. It really shouldn't surprise you that I'm the spectrum. Look at what I'm doing. This would be concerning if I wasn't on the spectrum. In any case, just concluding thoughts on the show. It seems like Project Build It was the moment the show started doing more for merchandising. This show got a lot of mileage out of only a handful of machines, I remind you. Introducing Scrambler, fine. Bringing Benny back, fine. Introducing Sumsy, weird. So soon into the series, we get a new character who is a forklift, like Trix. And it's strange, not just because Trix never shows up again, but also because you could rewrite Sumsy's introduction episode and make it about Trix simply changing jobs, and it'd barely change. I know they're the same machine, so it makes sense for them to share a character model, but I fail to grasp the essential differences between Trix and Sumsy personality-wise. These two always struck me as the same character at different points on their career journey. You'll also see most of the characters in Project Build It were slightly recolored or retooled versions of pre-existing characters that they weren't using at this point. And even when we started getting original designs like Tumbler, Gripper and Grabber, and Rubble much later on, they were machines that served the same purpose as ones we'd already had. That redundancy is intentional, I'm aware, but still. We even got vehicles like Splasher, Packer, and RV, which actively aren't construction vehicles. But I gotta tell you, Splasher turned out to be the man. Dude's an amphibious vehicle who was most useful in Fixham Harbor, but he still worked in Sunflower Valley where he served little to no purpose. He showed up a whole season before it made sense for him to show up. But whether merchandise too much or not, I think it's worth noting how manageable the toys for the show were. Of course, it's still a sizable cast, so a kid's gonna have a lot of collecting to do, and there's a lot of different toys out there, but the cast of vehicles is much smaller than something like Thomas and Friends, and the main cast is much more distinct. So it's much easier to get a majority of the characters as toys. So parents of the era would have had much better treatment of their wallets by comparison to, again, Thomas, among others. Granted, there were really only 2 expansive ranges for toys in this show that I could find, and neither one seemed to include every character, which I imagine would have driven a kid crazy, but still worth noting that even the merchandise, though obviously merchandise, wasn't too outrageous. The one negative I could think of in this show is that episode titles kinda don't matter half the time. They're all very similar. Good luck trying to tell Scoop the Teacher from Scoop Knows It All. I didn't know where else to mention this in the script, but the crew are surprisingly great at their jobs. No joke, the biggest thing they've built was this massive stadium, and with only a little extra help, they did it all in just 3 days. I've seen houses take years. How'd they do this so quickly? I have a sneaking, unresearched, and unconfirmed suspicion that the series might have had budget issues around the time of Project Build It. It would certainly explain why most of the new machines introduced at first were all either recolored or retooled versions of older characters, or imported from the movies, or in Zoomer's case, both. Plus, the American dub just stopped redubbing certain characters around that time, which is a weird thing to do if there aren't budget issues. That might also explain why around the time they started introducing a bunch more characters, they just ended Project Build It on a clip show, an episode type that's usually used to save budget. Plus, right after, Ready Steady Build switched to CG, which is much cheaper. Budget issues would also explain why there was no transition into Ready Steady Build, almost as if they were planning on making another movie or special to bridge the gap between seasons that wound up never being made. I have no way to confirm this theory, it's all just speculation, but still, I'd love to know whether or not it's true. Doing research for this episode was difficult, mostly because the Bob the Builder wiki is filled with what I can only assume is either misinformation or outright nonsense. Like, look at some of this stuff. Jackaroo was supposed to be in Project Build It? Scoot and Zoomer are siblings, even though that's never said anywhere on screen? Ready Steady Build isn't even canon to the rest of this show? Even if this stuff is true, they don't cite sources. I have no idea how they'd even know this, either misinformation or nonsense. Whatever the case, I hope I did some justice to what I think is one of the best shows for preschooler audiences that I've seen. Much as it's not my ballpark anymore, I really don't want to see children's entertainment drop the facade and become just low-effort nonsense. I know it's probably not my place, especially since I don't even aspire to create that kind of content, but as a former child myself, I remember a time when we could have nice things. Not when we wanted things to be not as bad as they are now. If you're a parent, keep an eye on what your kid is watching, and I hope this video served as a guideline to what to look for in preschool animation. Because if not that, then I don't know what other purpose it would have served. I watched Bob the Builder front to back for this. Don't make my work in vain. Tune into other episodes of Cartoon Gateway for more cartoon discussion, or maybe more little-known facts about me, such as I'm also waiting for the film Moonfall to go public domain so I can write a sequel to that. The working title is Moonfall 2, Here Comes the Sun.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.